Welcome to Module 1.3, Assessing Risks. We would like to acknowledge our funders from CMHC through the Housing Supply Challenge. We would also like to acknowledge that this course is being offered in partnership with the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, as well as Wausau Distant Education Centre. To start off, we have some guiding questions. By the end of Module 1.3, you will be able to answer the following questions. What is a project risk? What is risk assessment and how is it applied to project management? What kinds of risks are typical for construction projects? How are risks identified, analyzed, and evaluated? Bottom-up approaches as well as top-down approaches? And what are appropriate strategies for planning and responding to different risks? What is a project risk? A risk is any uncertain event or condition that can negatively impact a project if it occurs. Risks will vary from project to project, but an example might include severe weather or lack of winter road availability. If this occurs, the project could face delays and cost overruns. Listing and assessing risk is part of completing the feasibility analysis to determine whether a project should be funded and approved. Assessing risk during the project initiation stage is a proactive approach. At this stage, assessing risk is about ensuring that the project risk level is manageable. Part of this is creating strategies to manage the risks to support the project's success. What is risk assessment? Risk assessment is a process that follows a few general steps that we will build on throughout this module. First, identifying and listing risks. What risks currently exist? What risks could potentially exist within the project? The second is analyzing factors associated with the risk. What is known about the risks? The third, evaluating risks for the likelihood and impact. How likely is the risk to occur and how could this impact the project? And lastly, developing plans for risk response and management. If the risk does occur, how will we respond? How will this impact the project and the project team? So what risks are typical for construction projects? Risks can be internal or external to the project and the project team. Examples of internal risks can include unrealistic or short timelines or schedules to complete the project or the project stages, construction drawings produced by architects or engineers that are hard to interpret, shifting political support, or staff turnover within the project team. Examples of external risk can include supply chain challenges, including winter road access and material shortages. This could also include the high cost for airline freight, inflation and associated cost overruns, and reliability of contractors. In the last slide, we reviewed some of the potential risks that a construction project carries that can have serious impacts on the budget, timeline, or quality of the project. You can pause here to try and consider some of the internal or external risks you may be experiencing within your projects or that have existed in projects you've worked on in the past. How is risk identified, analyzed, and evaluated? Risk mapping is the process of identifying various internal and external risks that may occur over the course of a construction project. Most often, risk is identified, analyzed, and evaluated through a combination of discussing the complexity of a specific project and reflecting on experience with past projects. There are two main approaches used for this, a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down approach. Often, these two approaches are used in combination to inform, understanding, and mapping project risk. Here are some bottom-up approaches to mapping risk. The project team can review past financial statements to identify where there have been cost overruns in the past and which costs were not accounted for in the initial budgeting phase. Creating a flowchart of the construction process to show key steps and identify potential stages where internal or external events could negatively impact the project. Brainstorming all potential risks or risk scenarios with the project team, and discussing which risks are more or less likely based on their collective experience. Developing an influence diagram where project risks are identified through a cause-effect analysis. For example, what causes the effect of a specific cost overrun? Some top-down approaches to mapping risk include reviewing a case study of one specific past project and identifying areas where issues occurred, or reviewing the contingency plans or funds used in past projects to identify the level of risk that was assessed for past projects. Risk severity. Many project managers find it useful to think of level of risk as being something that can be determined based on two factors: probability, how likely is it to happen to the project, and impact, how harmful would it be if it happened to the project. Some calculations weigh these two factors equally, while others consider impact to be more important than probability. This calculation can be customized to fit the context for specific projects. Recording risk severity. Using this formula, probability times impact, the project manager can calculate the relative risk of different things that may change or go wrong during the course of the project. In addition to the description of each risk and the calculation of risk severity, a risk register will be a more useful document if it indicates who is responsible for monitoring and dealing with each risk, mitigation strategy, and other information. The next few slides will show two templates, one basic and one advanced, which contain different levels of detail about each risk. A project risk register can contain whatever information the project manager thinks is useful, and the columns included can be modified to meet the needs of the organization or a specific project. This is how project managers rank probability of risk. The likelihood that each risk or adverse event will happen is given a ranking by the project manager. In this case, a scale of 1 through 5 was used, where 1 was rare, 2 unlikely, 3 possible, 4 likely, and 5 almost certain. This does not have to be completed by the project manager alone. This could be done with the wider project team, and collaboration could increase the quality of the risk assessment. We will now look at how to rank the impact of each risk. The harm that each risk or adverse event might cause is given a ranking by the project manager. In this case, a scale of 1 through 16 was used, where 1 was insignificant, 2 was minor, 4 moderate, 8 was major, and 16 was severe. In this case, the number associated with each level of impact doubles as the impact increases. This model or equation therefore weighs impact more heavily than probability when calculating risk. By assigning and then multiplying the probability and impact scores of each risk together, a score is assigned that determines the severity of the risk. This matrix is color-coded to identify the severity of the risk, helping to easily identify the risk level. Let's look at an example of risk severity. If there are changes in architectural plans that require additional or different resources, then there will be delays. Through risk mapping exercises involving a case study review of your First Nation's most recent project, considered in the top-down approach, you determine that the chances of this happening are rare. Using an influence diagram you created for the project as part of the bottom-up approach we learned earlier, you determine that the impact of the risk happening to the project would be major. Given this information, you rank the probability at 1, the impact at 8, and you reach a risk severity score of 8. Despite its high impact score, the risk severity ends up being low due to its probability. So once you've ranked the risk severity, what's next? How do we plan to respond to the risk? Once risks are identified and evaluated, it is the responsibility of the project manager to clarify the risk response or contingency plan, or reserves or funds, required to proceed with the project. The project manager should communicate the level of risk along with the overall feasibility of the project to leadership. High-risk projects are typically less likely to get approved or funded, and having strategies to mitigate and respond to risks are critical to demonstrate to both leadership and funders that the project is in capable hands and has been thought through and has adequate time and funds to be completed to a high quality standard. Here we have an example of what a project risk register looks like. It includes if and then statements. For example, if Zach hits his hand with a hammer, then he will need to get a first aid kit. Pretty high probability that this will happen on a job site, but pretty low impact to the project. Let's say probability is at a 5 and impact is at a 2. This would result in a risk severity score of 10. Mitigation could include having a first aid kit on site, and the status would include the location of the first aid kit and the last date it was updated. Let's look at another example. If your First Nation has decided to build new homes in the spring, you will need to complete a risk register for all the associated risks with that project. What would a risk register look like for poor winter road availability? In our first column, we have the reference ID. This can be any number you assign to the associated risk. Next, we have the date raised, followed by the risk description, including an if-then statement. For this example, we have, if there is no winter road, then we could see very high shipping costs. The probability has been ranked at a 2, the impact has been ranked at an 8, and the probability times the impact has given us a risk severity score of 16. Our mitigation or response plan includes early planning, airline freight, and stockpiling of materials. The status of our mitigation or response plan includes ongoing monitoring. This could be monitoring of material stockpiles, monitoring of the winter roads, and monitoring of airline freight costs. And you will assign an owner to this risk whose responsibility it will be to continue that ongoing monitoring and evaluate the risk as the season changes. For our second example, we will consider what a risk register would look like for inflation of lumber costs due to external factors such as the pandemic or tariffs. In our first column, we have our reference ID. Next, we have the date raised, followed by the risk description, including our if-then statement. In this case, if tariffs or other factors affecting inflation happen, then we could see a significant increase in lumber costs. This has been ranked with a probability of 4, an impact of 16, and our probability times impact give us a risk severity score of 64. The mitigation or response plan will include early communication with funders, locking in prices with contracts and contractors, as well as stockpiling materials and supplies. The mitigation or response status. Let's look at a third example. What would a risk register look like for lack of electrician availability? We have our reference ID in the first column, the date raised, the risk description, including if-then statement. If the electrician cannot arrive in community, then the electrical work will be delayed, delaying other phases of the project. The probability has been ranked at a 2, the impact has been ranked at a 4, and our probability times impact has given us a risk severity score of 8. The mitigation or response plan includes planning early or reaching out to multiple electricians for availability options. The status of our mitigation/response plan, ongoing monitoring. Again, we will assign this risk to an individual who will continue to monitor the risk and update the risk register as required. Here's one last example of what a risk register would look like for unexpected site conditions. Review the previous examples that we did together, and then take a minute to review the chart and fill in your own answers. Here are some additional resources that you can review for further learning or understanding.